Bring the word this evening, and so I'm grateful for that honor. And I bring that word in memory of the many that I personally knew who died of HIV and AIDS complications. But I bring also a word of hope. And so it is with that I invite you to pray with me this night. Let us pray together. All-embracing God, we thank you for your presence amongst us. And we thank you in that presence that there is hope, that there is love, that there is light in the darkness. Thank you for every life that has lived and breathed and reminded us and in fact challenged us to be committed to care and to justice and acts of compassion and kindness. Thank you for our history as a people. And thank you that we today stand on the shoulders of so many who have gone before us, who urge us on to bring an end to HIV and to AIDS. Embolden us. Give us courage and give us insight, that we might be a people with purpose this day, not just to look back, but to look forward. Look forward to a day when HIV does not exist, and a generation that is HIV-free. Bless thus this night as we share these words together. In Jesus' name, amen. So I was about a 20-year-old young man in Bournemouth, England, where I was raised and grew up. And at about 20 years of age, I was already in seminary, moving towards the professional ministry. And at that time, there was this thing that was happening in the United States of America amongst gay men specifically, who were dying of unknown infection. And news very quickly moved through the gay male community specifically as we began to understand that there was something that was happening in the gay community that doctors and physicians and those with education didn't seem to know or could not pinpoint what was happening. We were hearing about it out of New York and out of San Francisco and Los Angeles. And I remember as I was growing up and as I was a 21-year-old man in seminary, hearing some of the rhetoric that was specifically coming out of the United States about God's judgment on a particular group of people. I remember those days vividly because I was coming out as a gay man. In fact, I was never in as a gay man. I was always out as a gay man. There wasn't a closet big enough to hide me. My mother always told me that when I came out of the closet, they burnt the damn thing down. But I remember vividly thinking about this rhetoric that I was hearing, and specifically, as I say, out of the more conservative end of Christianity. And I remember vividly challenging my own self about a theology of God's wrath. And remembering passionately the scriptures that I would read over and over again about God's love for everyone. And not being able to reconcile this notion of a God who somehow would cause judgment upon any particular group of people, and why on earth was this happening? I remember it vividly because when I was 22, I was graduating out of seminary, and at 23, ordained into the Christian ministry. And by then, what was happening daily in the United States was happening daily in the United Kingdom. Over and over again, we would hear of young gay men specifically who were dying. It wasn't called AIDS at that point. Some at that point didn't really have much of a name. But gradually we began to understand this as a disease that was being spread through sex. and then through intravenous drugs, but direct blood-to-blood contact. I'm sure those of you who were sat around this place in this day and today as we sit in memory can remember the horror stories, the pandemic, the fear, and the judgment. I remember at 23 taking on my first congregation and working part-time in the church and part-time secularly. And I remember as people in my own community were dying, the response of our community trying to find ways in which we could care for young men who were dying, and working with hospitals who just had no idea what to do. I'm sure many of you had horror stories of going to hospitals and people who you loved and who you knew were not being given the proper care. I remember walking into my first hospital back in Bournemouth, England, and nurses who were fearful of walking into the room and who would leave outside of the room trays of food, fearful of going in case they would also be infected. Nurses and doctors wanting us to dress up in what would seem like spacesuits in order just to go in, and I remember vividly refusing both of those things. And grabbing trays of food from outside of hospital rooms and taking them in and sitting with those who I knew and those who I loved and holding them, feeding them, giving them attention. At 23-year-old, I was not really prepared for two things. One, to be a pastor, and two, to be burying more people than I care to remember. I remember setting up helplines in my own country for people to be able to call and to find out the latest facts because the facts weren't present. And I remember specifically because the religious experience in the United Kingdom is very different than the religious experience in the United States. And I remember vividly being able to sit with patients at their bedsides as their breath would ultimately leave their body. And then clergy, people of my own tradition and my own faith, refusing to pray on bodies who were dying, refusing to do orders of service, and giving people dignified end-of-life care. In my hometown in Bournemouth, England, we were very lucky to be able to have bequested to us a building that had just recently been completely renovated, and we had the second HIV/AIDS hospice outside of London, one of the biggest in Europe outside of London. And I remember being a chaplain at that hospice. I'm going to tell you some of my greatest joys in ministry were at that hospice. As folks who were stigmatized in hospitals were now receiving the care that they needed in hospice. And I remember it was an old convent that had been recently renovated and recently made absolutely beautiful. And these nuns who could no longer take care of it, offering it to us for those who were dying of HIV and AIDS complications. And the only stipulation that they had was that none of the statues around the building could be removed. So picture this: a Catholic convent, gay men specifically, and all of the statues. At the bottom of the driveway, as you drove into the hospice, there was a huge statue of a very white Jesus. In this position, touchdown. As a chaplain, I would visit many of the young gay men who were in the hospice, and because of the fear of religion, especially religion that had condemned so many of them, one way in which I would help to bridge the conversation with some of these men was I had a cartoon made of this Jesus with his arms in the air, with clouds above, and invited them to write, "What on earth could Jesus be saying?" You can imagine the creativity of many of these young men. not just all Christian. I remember specifically one Jewish patient who put in the cloud, "Oy vey, not another puff coming up the drive." For those of you who don't know British, puff means homosexual. It was our way of being able to bridge the gap, to allow people to know that we were safe, to allow people to know that this religion that had been used to condemn them could also be a religion that was used to love them, to embrace them. And I remember so vividly on Saturday mornings and Friday evenings conducting memorial services. Cathedral of Hope, you know what that's like. And many of you in this place know what that's like. It is said that during the worst of the AIDS pandemic and through the AIDS pandemic in this particular congregation, just this congregation, over 2,000 members of this church died due to AIDS complications. And at the very front of our building, you cannot miss our bell wall. And every time that those bells peal, either on Sundays or during the week, it is a constant reminder to the lives that we lost due to the AIDS pandemic. But those bells are also a call to end AIDS. Those bells are also a call to a place of justice. Those bells are also a call to the people of faith to end the stigma and the religious hypocrisy that has surrounded HIV and AIDS for far too long. Those bells are a call to justice for this congregation and for congregations like us to say that when any new infection, any new diagnosis is because we have not confronted the stigma and discrimination that continues to exist for those who are infected with HIV in our world today. And those bells are a constant reminder to this congregation, and I believe to all good people of faith, that we must begin to have the conversation that will ultimately bring an end to AIDS. And not to be afraid about talking about sex. And not to be afraid of talking about our bodies, and not to be afraid of talking about prevention, and not to be afraid of talking about those things that are sacred to each and every one of us. To call to an end the stigma that continues to mean and happen in our world. And specifically, I will say this to my gay brothers and sisters, my gay brothers in this congregation. The stigma that continues to happen amongst gay men who do not want to talk about HIV. I know that there are people in our community, in this church, right at this moment, who are afraid to tell people that they are HIV positive because they think that the stigma is still existing within our community. That is something we cannot tolerate. That is something that we as a congregation must heal. And it is something about this congregation that we must be bold enough to not only hear that there are people living with HIV in our community, in this room, right at this very moment, but to provide the care and the love and the compassion and the nurture that is needed so that those people feel encouraged and loved in this place. And that goes beyond the walls of the Cathedral of Hope. That goes to the Strip on Cedar Springs. It goes to the way that those who are HIV negative describe themselves when they talk about clean rather than unclean. It goes to the way that we must allow our bodies to be sacred one more time. And for those of us in our community who have worked long and hard to care for those who are living with HIV and to bury those who have died of AIDS and AIDS complications, we cannot just sit back and say that was something we did then. It is something that we must recommit to today, to end the stigma and to end the silence and to ensure that the education that everybody needs around what is safer sex, around PrEP, around the other condoms. Because you know, You might be on PrEP and you might be undetectable, but there are many other diseases that still exist in our community that we don't talk about. I know, standing up here behind a pulpit, behind a chair and talking about sex and PrEP and condoms. It's the time I'm allowed to once a year to talk about it from the pulpit. We've worked long and hard for where we are today. And we must be here till the end. Until there is no more stigma, until there is no more discrimination, until there is no brown and black bodies who are being disregarded around HIV prevention and HIV cure. We cannot be silent. And a World AIDS Day service is not just an opportunity to come together and to remember a World AIDS Day service is an opportunity for us to be educated and to take that education out into the world. And for those of us who are people of faith, it is for our responsibility to point out the hypocrisy of a church and of a religious people who continue to use God as a God of hatred and vengeance rather than a God of love and compassion, and to speak our truth into the world and into the church. The prophet said, I've come to appoint you with good news. And the good news is that we have people who are living much, much longer now, especially in this country, due to the medications and the science that has moved us forward. But there are also too many people around our world who do not have access to such medications. And there are too many pharmaceutical companies that are living off the profit of those medications, which means that people in developing countries don't get access to what many of us take for granted. Anyone who profits from someone's unwellness should be thinking about what they believe in and where their faith directs. I come from a country where healthcare is free. I don't know why we can't have free healthcare here in the United States of America. I invite us this evening to recommit, to speak up, to speak out, and to create, at least in this community, an environment where there is no more stigma to those who are HIV positive and living amongst us, and to bring it out of the closet. Perhaps a challenge for us as Cathedral of Hope is to think about where we might be able to place some safer sex information, condoms, femidoms, and to provide we do already provide regular testing, but perhaps to speak it more often into this space. Otherwise, our bell wall means nothing. And our 24-hour vigil that we have at the base of the bell wall means nothing if we don't commit over and over again to be in this to the end, to fight it to the end. This evening I offer some words of encouragement, but those words will only make a difference if we embody them and make them real. I pray for those whom we've lost prematurely, but their lives cannot be in vain. Their lives will make a difference if we take the message into the world. I'm grateful for what I was able to do then and for what I'm able to do now. 2 years ago, when I came to this congregation, about 2 weeks after I was here, there was the big announcement of marriage equality. It was a wonderful celebration that day. I've kept a log over the years of the number of men and women who I buried personally. Hundreds. Personally. About 6 months ago, I was able to say I've now married more same-gender couples than I've buried. You know, what a relief that was. What I realized in that moment, though, was I was still grieving. I was still grieving every life that I had lost. And I know that there are people in this congregation this night who have and who are still grieving the past, still grieving lives that are lost. Some of us perhaps even have survivor guilt that we didn't die as well. It's hard. But my hope is that those of us who live now in the grace of God will not only claim our healing for ourselves, but will ultimately claim a healing for the world. And that the world might come to know the healing God that we know. Not the healing God that will somehow make AIDS disappear, because I don't believe God brought AIDS to the world in the first place. But that healing will come to the world because we have committed to being healing agents of injustice and stigma and discrimination. That's when we know that God has become present. May God bless us this night. Amen.